So let's start out with a fairly obvious point. Human beings are not the only animals that play. And exactly which animal species play and how we can determine whether in fact what we're observing is play are difficult and tricky matters, and certainly behavioral biologists aren't fully agreed. It seems fairly obvious that certain complex animals, especially mammals like dogs or dolphins or cats, engage in play. But some biologists have attributed play not just to less complex or large mammals, but even to creatures as far removed from us as insects. So where and how you draw that line is a bit of a tricky one, and I don't think it's settled, nor will it be settled. But it does seem like there are certain behavioral cues that when we observe them, we are not unreasonable in attributing play to that animal. Most notably is the exhibition of certain forms of behavior that are like certain functional forms of behavior, but also kind of attenuated forms of them. So one common example is play fighting, that a lot of animals will fight one another in various contexts, and play fighting has many of the characteristics of actual fighting, but in certain ways it doesn't go all the way. So for example, when you see two animals play fighting, there will often be a role reversal, where an animal that is sort of winning the fight will roll over and assume a more submissive posture so that the other animal can take a dominant position and the play fighting can go on. And animals that are play fighting generally aren't trying to hurt one another too much, and any action that actually does cause real hurt will break up the play. So it's imitative of actual fighting, but there are certain limits on it that suggest that something other than actual fighting is what's at work there. So that's just one example. Another feature that is common of play is a certain kind of repetition in the behavior, so that you can imagine a cat playing with a ball of yarn or whatever will keep on batting at it. There's a certain repetition in play activity, as well as a certain relaxed field that animals that are under stress generally don't play. So it's usually only in contexts where animals are relaxed that play goes on. So those are some features that might be clues that what you're observing in an animal is some form of play. Obviously, you need to know a lot about the animal's regular behavior in order to be able to get a sense of what play might be and how to distinguish play from non-play behavior. And in particular, there are two kinds of behavior that are possibly related to play that need to be ruled out as sort of different from play. One is exploratory behavior, which has features of curiosity and open-endedness that are often common in play. But exploration is generally seeking out new stimuli, whereas play tends to be a bit more repetitive. On the other hand, there are certain forms of repetitive behavior that are often called stereotyped behavior. For example, an animal that's sort of constantly licking a wound, and this often happens with animals that have grown up in stressful situations, that they'll sort of start doing this kind of compulsive repetitive behavior. And so there it's again important to recognize the importance of a kind of a relaxed field rather than stress as a marker of play behavior. So on one hand, there are certain markers that can help us note when an animal might be possibly playing, but there are also notes of caution about how to avoid misattributing play to animals that aren't actually playing. The next question is, why play at all? Why do humans or other animals play? And this is a vexed question in evolutionary biology. So one of the central tenets of evolutionary biology is the idea that any trait that is widespread across a species, and especially one that is widespread across many species, should have some adaptive benefit, that it would not have been selected for if it didn't confer benefit on the species. So for example, humans have very big brains, and they're very energy intensive, so that the brain requires about 20% of the oxygen and 20% of the glucose that the body takes in. And if the brain wasn't doing something useful for us, that huge energy expenditure would be costly. And human beings who had huge brains would probably die out in competition with other human beings who were expending their energy in more useful ways if big brains weren't useful. So that's one hint that having a big brain is really useful, that it is so costly energy-wise that we wouldn't have successfully evolved big brains if they didn't serve some benefit that would perpetuate the species. So similarly with play then, there's this question of what benefit does play provide? Now, one obvious issue here is that play is deliberately useless. Play is frivolous. Part of what makes play play is that it is fun, that it doesn't serve any purpose. So to the extent that play is useful, it's not useful because we're doing it in order to do something useful. It's sort of useful behind the scenes. It sort of provides a kind of hedonic payoff. It's enjoyable. We have fun doing it. And it just so happens that we have fun doing it, and as a result, some other benefit arises. In that sense, it might be kind of like sex, that a lot of the time when humans and other animals have sex, they're not thinking, I must reproduce the species. They're thinking, gosh, this is lots of fun, and they're doing it for the fun of it. And then there is some payoff of baby making down the line that gives it its sort of evolutionary boost. The trouble with play, though, is unlike sex, it's very hard to see what the payoff is. And not just that, but there are clear disadvantages. So there's one very influential study of seal pups that showed that seal pups, about 85% of the seal pups that were killed by sea lions in this particular study were killed while they were playing, while they only actually spend 6% of their time playing. So 85% of fatalities occur during this activity that only takes up about 6% of their time. Clearly, a lot of seal pups are getting killed because they're distracted by the fun of play. So if there's no evolutionary benefit to this, then they're doing something tremendously costly, and then it's very hard to explain why they evolved this capacity for play in the first place. And the funny thing is there isn't really any clear answer to why animals play. So one obvious one is that there's some kind of practice involved. And again, play fighting is a good example of this, that by play fighting you get better at actual fighting. But there's a lot of, it sounds like a good story, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, first of all, play fighting isn't especially good training for actual fighting, because it involves holding back in various ways. And also that animals that play fight less when they're young aren't necessarily worse fighters when they mature. So the idea of play as a kind of preparation seems plausible and attractive, but there's very limited evidence to support it. Another theory is that it might have something to do with socializing animals. And play is indeed quite common, or mostly common, among more social animals. So there's maybe a kind of a bonding that happens that then serves playful animals later in life. There could also be some theorize that it's good for cognitive development, that the openness and experimentation that's involved in play maybe helps the brain develop. But again, there's very limited evidence to show that this is the case. So the question of why animals play and what evolutionary benefit it serves is still very much an open question, and one that doesn't seem to have any obvious answer. Now let's turn our attention to the domain of human play. And I want to start by saying a little bit about two really influential early texts in the modern study of play. The first is a book by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga called Homo Ludens, which literally means man the player. So it's playing on the idea of Homo sapiens, defining us, Homo, the man, as the sapient one, the wise one. And he instead suggests that our distinctive characteristic is our capacity for play. Ludus is the Latin word for play. And Huizinga argues that the sorts of accounts that I was just giving about sort of biological or evolutionary adaptation are never going to capture fully the significance of play. Because to understand play, you have to understand it from the inside. You can't just sort of ask from the outside, why are these creatures playing? You have to analyze it from the question of what does it do for us? What is the experience of play like? And so his book is an attempt to unpack the ways in which play features in various aspects in human culture. And in the opening chapter, one of the influential ideas he develops there is what's come to be known as the magic circle. He sort of mentions the idea of a magic circle in passing, but it's come to carry a lot more weight. And the idea is that play always unfolds in a space that is separated off from ordinary life. And you can see this clearly, say, in a basketball court, right? That you've got, first of all, a spatial boundary. You've got the sort of the paint that outlines the court. And as soon as the ball goes off that court, or if a player touches the ball and is off the court, the ball is out of play. So the game is only in play within this very specially designated space. What's more, the play is only active during a certain specially designated period of time. So, within a basketball game or a football game or various other sports, there's usually a clock that counts down how much time there is. And when the buzzer goes, whatever happens doesn't count. And also, play is socially delimited. And again, you can see this in most sports quite clearly, where players wear uniforms and they are marked out as players as such. And if a spectator runs onto the court and starts interfering with the game, they haven't helped their team win, they've just broken up the game, because only specially designated people can play. So you have this idea of a magic circle, which is spatially bounded, is bounded in space, it's temporally bounded, is bounded in time, and it's socially bounded, so that only specially designated people can be a part of this. Now, part of what Huizinga thinks is significant here is that this basic structure is much more widespread in human culture than just in games. So one example he gives is of the religious ritual. And so you can imagine a Catholic Mass as one that is spatially bounded by the boundaries of the church. There's a temporal boundary in the sense that it's only during the time of the Mass that all of this stuff is in action. You can wander into a church outside of the time of the Mass, and it's just sort of the space that you're in. And then there are also, again, socially very specially designated roles, notably the priest, but also people, for instance, who take the Eucharist are participating in a ritual that makes them a part of it. And so Huizinga thinks that this basic structure of play is much more widespread. And for him, this isn't a sign that, all the things that, have this structure, whether it be the arts or religion, these are two examples he spells out in some detail, is not to say this is just a bunch of fun and games, but rather to say play is a lot more important than you ordinarily suppose. The other thinker who's had a significant impact on the early study of play is the French theorist Roger Caillois, who wrote a book called Man, Play, and Games. And one of his contributions, and maybe the most influential one, is a division of forms of play into 4 categories. So he talks about agon, which is, and he uses Greek words for all of this because he's a scholar and likes using Greek words, uses the word agon to talk about competitive play. This is the sort of play in which, 2 teams go up against each other, whether it's chess or basketball, but you get the basic idea that it's sort of a pitting of talent against talent. And he says one of the central things there is a basic equality, that the idea in any competitive game is that at the start, the 2 sides are equal. So that, in chess, for example, black and white, the only difference between them is that white gets to go first. It's sort of the least inequality that can possibly be arranged. Second form of play he describes as alea, which are games of chance. So roulette, poker, various kinds of card games, various kinds of dice games, where there he feels like the drama there is playing on the fact that we all recognize that our lives are hostage to fate. And in some sense, we're sort of playing with the idea that our lives are open to chance. And as you can see with the example like poker, alea and agon often go together. You can have these competitive games where there's an element of skill and an element of chance thrown in together. Third category he talks about is mimesis, that of play acting. So this is games of make-believe, theater, charades, that sort of thing, where you take on roles other than the one you ordinarily adopt. And the last category he explores is ilinx, or games of vertigo. So roller coaster rides is a good example, or the kinds of children games where you spin around in circles until you get dizzy and fall down. And there, for Caillois, what's significant is that that loss of rational and conscious control and the dizziness that entails. I said earlier that human beings are not the only creatures that play, but arguably, human beings are the only creatures that play games. So Huizinga is interested in the phenomenon of play in general. Caillois classifies different types of play. The philosopher Bernard Suits, in a charming book called The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia, sets out to give a rigorous, necessary and sufficient conditions type definition of what it is to play a game. And the definition he provides comes in 3 parts. The first part is that he says all games have what he calls a prelusory goal. There is something that you are trying to do in the game that can be specified independent of the rules of the game. So if you're in a race, the prelusory goal is to cross the finish line. Or if you're playing soccer, the prelusory goal is to put the ball in the net of the opposing team. Or if you're playing chess, the goal is to immobilize the king of the other side. Now, part of Suits's point, however, is that what makes a game is that you pursue this prelusory goal inefficiently. So in ordinary life, when we have goals, we try to achieve those goals as efficiently as possible. In games, we deliberately seek out less than maximally efficient ways of achieving those goals. So for example, if my goal in a race is to cross the finish line first, probably the most efficient thing is to get on a motorbike, and if there's a circular track, maybe cut across the infield to get to the finish line faster. Or if my goal in soccer is to get the ball in the opposing team's net, why not just pick up the ball and run with it? And the reason I don't pick up the ball and run with it in soccer is the rules say you can't pick up the ball and run with it, and the other team will get a free kick. And likewise, if you get on a motorbike and shoot across the infield, you're not going to win the race. And so the point is that all games impose rules that limit how we can go about pursuing the goal in a way that makes our pursuit of that goal more inefficient. So the goal of the game is what he calls the pre-illusory goal. It's the goal that can be specified independent of anything about how we do it. In addition to that, then, there are what he calls illusory means. There are only certain means that are allowed by the rules. And he says that the rules then are put in place in order to restrict the means by which we can pursue the goal of the game. And the third element of playing a game that he mentions is what he calls the illusory attitude, which is that we accept the rules of the game, we accept the constraints placed upon us simply for the sake of making the game possible. So to see this, consider two cases of a mountain climber. There's two people trying to climb a mountain. They have this pre-illusory goal of getting to the top of the mountain. One of them is climbing simply because they have no other means of getting there. That they don't have the sort of necessary tools that would get them there faster. The other is doing it for the challenge of it. Now imagine a helicopter comes along and says, "Hey, you guys want to lift?" The person who is just trying to get to the top of the mountain will say, "Yeah, please," and hop in the helicopter. The other guy will say, "No, I'm trying to get to the top of the mountain the hard way." And that second person is playing a game by Suits's definition precisely because they are pursuing this goal with not just with the restraint that they aren't doing it in the most efficient way, but they're choosing it for the sake of doing it in a less than maximally efficient way. So putting those three elements together, the idea of a pre-illusory goal, that there's something you're trying to do, the illusory means, which is that you're accepting certain constraints on what you're trying to do, and the illusory attitude, which is that you're accepting those constraints simply for the sake of making that activity possible, Suits arrives at a definition of playing a game that he sums up by saying, playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles.